Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. We still have two panels left, and we're running behind schedule. So, could you please take your seats? Just like to make an announcement first. If somebody has left a briefcase outside, you got it? Okay, great, perfect. It was at the front desk, I was going to say. Well, my name is Christian Ulrichsen. I'm a research fellow here at the Baker Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our third panel today on the internationalization of Persian Gulf security. And we've seen over the last several years how political developments in Iran and on the Arab side of the Gulf and perceptions of US disengagement, regardless of the reality, have triggered a diversification of political and security relationships that have accelerated the internationalization of Persian Gulf and of its security and strategic landscape. And we've had a number of mentions this morning of the Abraham Accords, of course, which have brought Israel into the equation in a much more meaningful way. And in 2019, both Russia, with Chinese support, and Iran presented proposals separately trying to reimagine how a collective security architecture in the Persian Gulf might work. Neither of those proposals has gone anywhere, and of course the geopolitical landscape of 2022 is very different from 2019, not only for the pandemic, but also, of course, with the fallout from Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. The sense of a security community in a state of flux has also deepened as European officials diverged from the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign after 2018, and Saudi and Emirati leaders called for regional de-escalation after a series of attacks on maritime and energy targets in 2019 as part of what Iranian officials would have called the maximum resistance campaign to the maximum pressure approach. And I would argue that the impact of the attacks on Abqaiq and Al-Khudais in Saudi Arabia on the 14th of September 2019 was absolutely critical. It punctured the air of assertiveness of Saudi and Emirati policy. It triggered a move to de-escalate tension to the extent that when Qasem Soleimani was killed in Iraq in January 2020, you had the Saudi Deputy Defense Minister flying to Washington to make the case in person to the Trump administration that this was not the time for another war. The very different rhetoric from the pre-2018, 2019 period. The lack of an overt US response to the attacks on Saudi Arabia really spooked regional leaders who I think until that point had assumed that they had a security guarantee from the United States that was shown perhaps not to be as ironclad as they had hoped. And we've seen over the last 2 years a series of reconciliations and rapprochements across much of the region. We've seen Saudi Arabia and the UAE separately reaching out to Iran in different ways through the Iraqis in the Saudi case indirectly, and then directly in terms of the UAE. We've seen over the last year high-profile meetings between Turkish and Saudi and Emirati figures, again dialing down one of the flashpoints that had seemed to define a lot of regional politics over the past decade. So we've seen how things have shifted there. We've also seen how the Abraham Accords have changed the equation, how new actors are now moving in. To what extent is especially the normalization between the UAE and Israel, which I think has moved fastest, and has much more of a security and defense component to it. Is this a beginning by Emirati and Israeli officials to think about what they see as a post-American Gulf or Middle East, where they stand up as they see it, the US stands down. We've also seen regional leaders begin to hedge, begin to diversify. In perceptions from the region, they see 3 US administrations, Obama, Trump, and Biden, which have each cast into some doubt the long-term commitment, as they see it, of the US in the Middle East and in the Persian Gulf. From their point of view, the way that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was handled last year was a shock, and I think it raised questions as to what could a withdrawal of a long-standing partnership or ally happen to us in some ways similar to had been talked about after Mubarak in Egypt was jettisoned in 2011. And we've seen the diversification of relationships to the extent that since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you've had the leaders or the de facto leaders of Saudi Arabia and the UAE declining to take phone calls from President Biden, but talking repeatedly with President Putin. So these are long-standing US partners who are becoming much more, not autonomous, but certainly much more diversified in their long-term relationships. We've seen that with just the last 2 days, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in the Gulf meeting with foreign ministers of all 6 Gulf countries in Saudi Arabia. And we've seen how one of the perceived spin-offs of the normalization between Israel and the UAE was the sale of F-35s to the UAE. Well, that deal has been held up in part because of US concerns about China's strategic and security presence in the Emirates. And so we're seeing very strong signals from leaders in Arab Gulf countries, partners of the US for decades, that they're not going to pick sides, they're not going to choose, and they're going to continue to project their own interests in a context where they think the US may not be around in the same way over the longer term. So in this panel, we have 4 excellent speakers. Their bios are in the program, so I won't introduce them all in detail, but each of them I've asked to speak for 7 or 8 minutes on one aspect of how they see the security dynamic complex in the Gulf, and then we'll have a quick Q&A between ourselves and then open up to questions and answers from the audience. So I would like to begin with Dr. Toby Matteson at Stanford currently, and then move to Dr. Catherine Harvey from Georgetown, and then my 2 colleagues from the Baker Institute, Dr. Mohammed Tabar, and finally with from the Center for Energy Studies, Dr. Jim Crane. So, Toby.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be back here at the Baker Institute and to be part of this most interesting conference. Allow me to also take up a few points that were raised during this morning's discussions, which I thought were very interesting and thought-provoking. So I'd like to speak to 3 sort of themes. The first theme, obviously the panel's theme, internationalization of Gulf security. The second point, I'd like to make a few comments on general US-Middle East relations. And the third on Saudi-Iranian dialogue, which Christian sort of asked me to talk about. So first of all, Gulf security, it depends on how we look at security and who we mean by security. If we talk about the regimes of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, the 6 Arab Gulf states, and the regime security of these states and the territorial integrity of these 6 states, then the US presence has actually been very beneficial since, for example, it repelled the Iraqi troops from Kuwait and so on and so forth. But if we take a more holistic view of regional security, that first of all takes in, the security of all the states that border the Gulf, Iran, Iraq, and the 6 GCC states, and if we widen sort of definitions of security to obviously also include the people of the countries concerned, and take a sort of more bottom-up approach, then we get a very different picture of sort of, what the current security landscape is and what maybe, the future will hold, and sort of what sort of policy recommendations we will draw from that. Because if we take that more sort of holistic approach, then in fact, the most dangerous player in the Gulf region has been the United States in the last few decades. And it's sort of a strange argument to make, but I was sort of encouraged by some of the, comments on the previous panels to sort of think outside of the box a little bit. But if we really think about it, the most serious wars and military interventions and sort of confrontations had a large, to a large extent to do with, American military interventions. And sort of the one exception to that is the 1991 Gulf War, the liberation of Kuwait. But even that, in some ways, is a consequence of US support for Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war, and the building up of the Iraqi military in that decade, which was a core sort of Gulf policy and also American policy. Of course, Iraq also received support from other states, but I'm just saying it is one of those things where short-term policy making leads to problems just a few years down the line. And so if we're starting to think about more longer-term strategic thinking, I think it's important to keep those things in mind. But really, the 2003 intervention in Iraq, again, illegal under international law, has really upset a lot of the, dynamics in the region, has led to, terrible consequences, really. And so if we start to think about how can such things be avoided, then a sort of bringing in more international players might be seen as a good thing. And so the proposal that you asked us to have a look at, since you mentioned it in the abstract, which is the Russian proposal from 2019, which was authored or supervised by Naumkin, a veteran Russian Middle East expert and diplomat. It actually tries to advocate for that, and it's something that especially the Iranians have called for a long time. But of course, that has often led to a serious pushback from the GCC state. I think one of the interesting things in that proposal that I found most interesting is sort of the broadening of the specter of what it means to security of this region to sort of include regions in the nearby where these states have, directly intervened, or which they sort of see as, their backyard. And that is especially Yemen, but also Syria, and sort of link the try to find a solution that is sort of links these different conflicts together. And I think, the intractability of sort of, the political situation in those conflicts justifies such a more holistic approach, especially when it comes to Yemen, because it's now so much part of sort of the Gulf, dynamics, and has really also shown what can go wrong in that regard. In terms of models, for such a sort of regional security arrangement, the OSZE is often mentioned. And I'm afraid on this point, and another point I want to make later, recent developments in Ukraine and generally in Europe are obviously, bad news, because the OSZE, which, was supposed to, monitor developments, military developments in Eastern Europe, and in fact did so up until the very point of the Russian invasion, and had monitors everywhere, and was monitoring, was reporting ceasefire violations from all sides, and so on and so forth. but was not really taken seriously in the media and was not able to, really influence, diplomatic initiatives and stop the war. And so if we think of that as the model for the Gulf region, it's a problem because, in the extreme situation, it might also not be able to prevent war. And so this leads me to my second point. I mean, it's been now made a couple of times, the argument that, American policy in the Middle East. Professor Brownlee also has obviously authored that famous book, Democracy Prevention. That sort of democracy promotion isn't really, part of American foreign policy. Ambassador Djerejian has also sort of said that this should not be such a serious part of American foreign policy. And obviously the Iraq war stands out as sort of, the worst example of what can follow from that. But, maybe sometimes the wrong lessons have been drawn from the Iraq war as well, because now we just have sort of a situation where the alliances are mainly with the most authoritarian of the states in the region. And I see a sort of wider problem for, America and the world, especially at this moment where the whole rhetoric of the political establishment and of the media is about this supposed war between freedom and autocracy, right? In Europe, it is now sort of we're back to sort of Cold War era arguments and discourse, and in this situation, and sort of freedom also versus China and so on. And the Middle East, completely stands out here. It makes absolutely no sense if we try to fit the Middle East into this sort of framework. In fact, sometimes it's sort of the opposite. And that also undermines sort of America's credibility on the world stage, and has led to a situation where, even close American allies, as has been mentioned, do not vote with the US on the Ukraine issue in the Security Council or in the UN General Assembly, and do not increase production quotas and so on and so forth. So I think a very difficult situation to sort of engage with, and it's sort of hard to come up with sort of easy recommendations for this fix. But I would just say current U.S. Middle East policy is really undermining sort of wider U.S. foreign policy, I would argue. And thirdly, I was just asked to say a few words more concretely, so I'm not just sort of saying these sort of broad perhaps provocative statements, something on the possibility of Saudi-Iran dialogue, because ultimately, while I mentioned the many other countries, Iraq and so on and so forth, the two big players really in the Gulf, and those that have been most at loggerheads for the past few decades have been Saudi Arabia and Iran. And it is really also here that you see a really sort of a problem in that cultural relations, haven't really existed much since the Iranian Revolution, and so initiatives at sort of dialogue. And I'd like to say there's a number of Track 2 initiatives and also direct negotiations now between Saudi Arabia and Iran in Iraq and elsewhere. And I've been, for a few years involved in one of these Track 2 initiatives, and it's been very, fascinating to see these sort of debates going on. And of course, there are many issues of common concern. They'd been mentioned before in the Israeli-Palestinian panel as well, climate change, other external shocks, things like ISIS and other things that are just sort of common concern. But and again, I think much progress has been made, and op-eds have been published with sort of specific steps that should be taken by both sides. So a sort of roadmap, I think, is there, but there needs to be, in this case, I think, more in terms of confidence-building measures, because the two sides have really ordinary Saudis have probably never met an Iranian and have for decades been sort of fed with a very negative attitude. And in Iran, let's face it as well, there's sort of a stereotype of sort of the Gulf Arab and sort of the Saudi, goes back to Khomeini, a sort of demonization of the other. And I think if these two can sort of, come closer together, we might come to a sort of better arrangement for the Gulf, which would also benefit the region. And so I know we basically should keep it very brief, and I hope you don't mind that I went a little bit outside of the remit of.
Thank you. Dr. Harvey.
Thank you so much, Christian, Dr. Ulrichsen. And I should just say I'm really honored and very thankful to be asked to be here. And this is a particularly nice experience for me. I finished my PhD about 2.5 years ago, and Toby was actually one of my 2 PhD examiners in the UK. I did my PhD in London, so that was very cool. And then actually I connected with Dr. Ulrichsen because he was one of my 2 peer reviewers on a book that I've recently had published. So it's particularly nice to kind of be with this group. Dr. Ulrichsen has asked me to speak on the Iraq, not Iran, Iraq portion of kind of the peace in the Gulf. And I really intend to keep this sort of very brief, and then I look forward to answering questions. And I should just say, first of all, that I'm just glad that this panel, that it includes an Iraq portion. Historically, today, and I mean really since 2003, maybe since 1991, since the liberation of Kuwait, I think many observers, commentators, in thinking about the Gulf, think of the Gulf as a bipolar system, as kind of Iran and Saudi Arabia. Historically, and we really forget this. Historically, it was a triangular system, and Iran was number 1, Iraq was number 2, and Saudi Arabia was sort of number 3 in terms of the power structure. In the 1990s, the 1990s began Iraq's kind of complete demise, and then of course in the post-2003 environment, Iraq was just a mess. So the Gulf really did become a bipolar system. Iraq just wasn't a player. And it's nice to see in recent years, Iraq still faces enormous challenges, but it is, it has stabilized considerably, since the kind of the conflict against ISIS, which is its most recent conflict of the past 40 years. And it's beginning to take steps to reassert itself in the region. And to, as I think the Iraqis would see it, to taking their rightful place, in the region, hopefully as a force for moderation as opposed to, what the region, witnessed under Saddam Hussein. So it's just nice. It's nice that the region may be sort of evolving more towards kind of like the triangular system that it used to be. But in terms of sort of where Iraq fits in and sort of the international relation, the security dynamic. Iraq today, a democratic Iraq, a Shia-led Iraq, an Iraq where it's kind of constituent communities, really have a very prominent position in the government as a whole. Iraq is committed to a non-aligned foreign policy. I think that all Iraqis, from across the spectrum, are committed to a policy of non-alignment in the region, to a policy of not being a part of any regional axis. I think the Iraqis will tell you, and I think that they are correct, that they have been the victims of axes in the region, that the bipolar tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or between any of the Turkey and the UAE, what have you, particularly Saudi Arabia and Iran, it plays out in Iraq. It doesn't play out only in Iraq, but Iraq is sort of the #1 battlefield, and so the Iraqis are committed to non-alignment. They're committed to, trying to build positive relationships with all of their neighbors, and they're very much committed to trying to bring their neighbors together. This is not some altruistic impulse on the part of the Iraqis. For the Iraqis, this is existential. When Saudi-Iran tensions flare, whether or not the Saudis and the Iranians are trying to meddle in Iraq, and that's a different question. But just by virtue of those tensions flaring, it inflames the situation in Iraq. So I think for the foreseeable future, Iraq will, it really is an existential interest on the part of the Iraqis to try to bridge these differences, to try to bring their neighbors together, to try to do everything they can to tamp down regional tensions. And I say bridge, the Iraqis will tell you, and again, I don't think this is, I don't think this is specific to any one community. I think that this is, the Iraqis writ large, Sunnis, Shia, and Kurds. They are committed to, eschewing the previous model of Iraq as the bulwark in the region, the bulwark against Iran. They are committed to Iraq being the bridge. So no bulwark. Today Iraq, they're trying to project Iraq as a bridge. And this is not actually, I think that for all the darkness of the, real kind of post-2003 period, saying that, the Iraqis are committed to being a bridge, this is not like new as of like the last 2 or 3 years. I think that, as early as 2005, 2006, 2007, the Iraqis recognized that at their best, they can be a bridge. It's just that there wasn't much opportunity for them to play that role at that point. Today, particularly in this new environment of detente, I think that's where the Iraqis can make a difference. And this is not to say that, Iraq is still, it has stabilized tremendously, but it's still not an entirely coherent place, not by a long shot. And so, the Iraqis are committed to this, but, and committed to kind of retaking their place in the Arab world and in the region. But, they will struggle and continue to struggle, just with, making their own country a more coherent entity. And the last thing that I want to touch on is that, again, this model of Iraq as bridge, what will make that successful is, if Iraq's neighbors accept that Iraq is committed to this policy of non-alignment. That, if Iraq's neighbors try to woo Iraq into a specific axis, this is when Iraq can only be successful and can really only be stable if its neighbors accept its neutrality. And for that matter, not only its neighbors, but also the United States. If we in the US, if the US and Iran, when tensions flare between the US and Iran, this also plays out in Iraq, as we've seen in recent years. So for Iraq to remain stable, not only do the Iraqis have a lot of work to do, but their neighbors and the United States, they're very much dependent on their neighbors and the United States for letting Iraq remain sort of stable. So I'll end it with that.
Thank you. Dr. Taba.
Thank you, Christian. I'm going to focus on Iran's threat perceptions and how it sees the Persian Gulf. Iran has been in search of a new security architecture in the region, one that allows Tehran to be a more assertive player, and at the same time it can reduce its isolation and vulnerabilities to the sanctions and threats that it perceives from the United States and its allies. This search for a new security arrangement coincides with what Tehran sees as a new Cold War on the horizon, a Cold War in which the U.S. is constrained by new rivals and challenges across the globe. As Washington is increasingly preoccupied with Russia and China, Iran sees both new opportunities and threats emerging in the Middle East. Having survived the most paralyzing sanctions by both the Trump and Biden administrations, Iran believes that it has acquired new sources of power. First of all, in the past couple of years, as a result of several elections in Iran, the conservative factions have managed to fully control different parts of the state. So Iran is now ruled by a relatively monolithic hardline faction led by the Revolutionary Guards. It's no longer divided as it was for decades. The more moderate factions that successfully pushed for the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA in 2015, have been sidelined since the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA. So they have been a major casualty of the U.S. maximum pressure policy. Despite massive social and economic crises in the country, this hawkish government under President Ibrahim Raisi, which is strongly backed by the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has shown resolve to advance Iran's nuclear missile program and also drone programs. Has deepened its ties with allies such as Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and the PMF, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, by sharing its missile and drone capabilities with them and creating a more powerful axis of resistance, as Iran calls it. Iran considers these actors deterrence forces against Washington and its regional allies. And if anything, Iran has been doubling down its support of these actors. At the same time, as several of my colleagues mentioned, Iran is reaching out to the GCC countries to reduce tensions and forge new bilateral security and economic agreements in the region. Iran's president recently visited Oman to revive a 20-year-old project to develop a shared gas field. Both Qatar and Oman are mediating between Iran and the United States to revive the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement. As Captain said, Iraq is also mediating between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and both Iranian and Saudi officials have said that these talks have been beneficial recently. So they have made progress, and negotiations will continue. And as Christian mentioned, Iran and the UAE have held talks as well. So we have yet to see if these negotiations will lead to any tangible results, especially given the deep tensions that exist between Iran and Saudi Arabia and Iran and the UAE, particularly after the Abraham Accords. Having used its leverage, primarily these proxies in the region, Iran is now signaling its readiness for a rapprochement with Saudi Arabia and UAE. Again, it's unclear to what extent this is a genuine and credible signal on the part of Iran, and to what extent the Saudis and the UAE are willing to reciprocate and genuinely interested. But I want to focus on one what I see as one important and new challenge in Iran that Iran is facing in the Persian Gulf, which could derail all these initiatives, and that is Israel. Iran's conflict with Israel is no longer limited to the Levant. The two are engaged in a shadow war on the sea, air, land, and cyberspace, all over the region and now inside Iran, and that is what's changing. The Israelis have said that they have changed their policies towards Iran, and instead of dealing with Iran's proxies in the Levant or other areas, they're hitting Iran, or as what they call the head of the octopus, directly in Iran. Israel's Prime Minister Bennett said a few days ago, right after an Iranian IRGC commander was assassinated in Iran, allegedly by Israel, he said that the era of Iran's immunity is over. Interestingly, Iranian leaders have had similar rhetoric. Iran's supreme leader has warned the US and Israel that the era of hit and run is over. If you hit us, we'll hit you back. So both sides are engaged in a multi-layered conflict. The Israelis say they're facing a wide range of threats, from knives to nuclear weapons, from Jenin to Isfahan, which is a major city in the center of Iran. And Iranian leaders say that Iran is dealing with a multi-front hybrid war, as Iran's supreme leader called it. And this confrontation involves assassinations, kidnapping, sabotage, confiscating oil tankers, carrying out missile and drone attacks, and fomenting protests and violence across the region. And it's happening almost every week, and sometimes several times a week. So the frequency is increasing. And each side leaves enough room for deniability. But they're carrying out more and more brazen operations. And as I said, the frequency is going up. So the animosity between Iran and Israel is, of course, not new. It goes back to the 1979 revolution and Iran's help creating Hezbollah in the 80s. But it used to be more limited, and the two often benefited from it. Iran used the Palestinian card to compensate for its isolation as a Persian Shia state in a Sunni Arab majority region. Israel could use the Iranian threat to further strengthen ties with the United States and overshadow the Palestinian conflict. Not to mention the two also even collaborated quietly in the past, including in the 80s during the Iran-Iraq War. But their animosity is now becoming more intense and I would argue even existential. Iran is ratcheting up its anti-Israeli threat and rhetoric, and according to Israel, Iran is providing more and more strategic weapons, including sophisticated missiles and drones to Hezbollah and other anti-Israeli forces. Meanwhile, Israel's operations inside Iran are targeting the very core of the regime's national security discourse, which could have wider consequences in Iran and broader region. And I'll say why. So in the past decade, the Iranian government has tried to boost its domestic legitimacy by claiming that it has protected the nation's territorial integrity against external enemies. And they often argue that otherwise Iran would have become another Iraq, Libya, Syria, or Afghanistan or Yemen. So they have repeatedly said, if we don't fight in Damascus, we'll have to fight in Tehran. So the leadership, using this argument, often urges Iranian citizens to support the regime for the sake of their own safety and security, even if they oppose the Islamist discourse ideology of the regime. Now, Israel's strategy is designed to show that Iran's assertive foreign policy has actually backfired. By carrying out operations in Iran, it intends to embarrass the regime, reveal its vulnerabilities, and increase the costs of its regional activities. So the calculation is that this could trigger opposition movements inside Iran and aggravate anti-regime protests that are going on almost on a daily basis now. Although one could argue that external attacks could also boost regime's popularity, as we saw in the case of the U.S. assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, the head of Iran's Quds Force a few years ago. Regardless, I think the point I'm trying to make is that these operations by both sides invite more retaliations in order to establish deterrence and credibility, which could in turn turn into a vicious cycle and drag other actors in the region. And the question is how long this shadow war is going to continue and whether or not it will escalate to a broader conflict involving the United States, the GCC, and others. So let me stop on this point, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen.
All right, well, everybody. Well, thanks for coming. It's nice to be in a room with people in it again here at the Baker Institute. And one thing we did to give you the authentic Gulf atmosphere in here was crank up the AC. So I don't know if anybody's noticed, but hot outside and freezing cold inside. It's just like it is in the Gulf. So hopefully we'll transport you there in that way. So I am going to talk about, so maybe a little bit more on the economic side of the security equation, and specifically on these events that are impacting big oil exporting economies. So there's two kind of main events. There's a sort of a slow track energy transition that's having a sort of a long run effect as oil demand starts to slow and at some point plateau, and then start to come back down eventually. That's one thing that Gulf governments and economies are starting to grapple with. Second one is sort of more short-run event, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, its effect on oil supply and pricing, and then the COVID recovery at the same time, right? The sort of surprisingly quick COVID recovery, and that's having also a big effect on oil demand, right? It's a bit of a surprise effect. So sort of a slower long run and a quicker short run effects. And they're also kind of in conflict, these two effects. So I'll talk about the second one first, the short run conundrum that's happening here. Starting with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, we've got really high oil prices, I'm sure you've noticed, bringing a huge transfer of wealth to oil exporting economies, including in the Persian Gulf. Kind of a big payoff for these guys for some, what we would consider here some bad behavior by Russia. We sometimes think about the resource curse as something that makes countries, as the academic theory argues, among other things, makes countries more prone to war. There's another side of this that's sort of a self-healing mechanism for conflicts. Is when oil exporting countries engage in conflict, it makes the oil price go up, and then they get a lot more resources, to either continue those conflicts or, in some cases, solve those conflicts. And that is what seems to be happening here. So Saudi export revenues, I just took a look this morning. They're up 123% year on year, first quarter of this year, and just in March alone, $30 billion in revenue. So that's about $1 billion a day, or if you chop it up another way, it's about $1,000 per capita per month in Saudi Arabia. Saudis and the UAE, of course, still have spare oil production capacity that they are keeping offline. So they have, a couple, 2 to 3 million barrels a day between them that's still being held back in abeyance. And they're bringing it back in slow increments of about 400,000 barrels a day per month, as OPEC has agreed, OPEC Plus, including Russia, has agreed for a while. And so they're basically ignoring these market stress points, these pretty acute stress points that we're feeling, and most of the world is feeling. $130 oil, 14 straight months of inventory declines in the developed world, and OPEC is basically ignoring it. It's still slow walking that oil back to market at that slow pace, and actually not even keeping pace with that, right? So they're still, underproducing. So they're over-complying with their quotas. So there's still some potential. I've been reading today, actually, Wall Street Journal had a story this morning talking about possibly that Saudi Arabia and the UAE might start to backfill, as they have in the past, for some of those quota shortages, in this case especially by Russia. The cartel's done that in the past. We'll see if they do. But regardless, they've got this big windfall that is flowing into these economies. One of the questions that's being asked is, what do they do with that windfall this time around? And I was chatting with some reporters about this recently. The last couple of booms, the 70s boom, if you spend time in that part of the world, you see all that 70s brutalist architecture around the region. And you can see, big building booms occurred from that. Also in the 2010s, right, starting in 2003, that second really big oil boom, some gaudy glass skyscrapers, in Dubai and Doha and Abu Dhabi and Riyadh, et cetera. This time, some of the Gulf governments are starting to signal that they are going to take some counter-cyclical fiscal discipline policies, holding on to those oil rents for now rather than spending them. So Saudi Arabia's actually got a budget surplus right now in the first quarter of this year. They're trying to replenish some of the reserves, the central bank reserves, and put some more money into their sovereign wealth funds. I think we could take some of this with a grain of salt, right? They're still going pretty hard in Saudi Arabia on the NEOM, this sort of a giant giga project on the Red Sea. And there was a go-ahead apparently on this project. I don't know if you've heard of this kind of audacious building project called the Line, the kind of linear city with the very tall and extremely long building, and that looks like it. That might get a kickstart from this current oil crisis. On the political side, short range, in this still in this sort of short range mode, Saudis and OPEC seem to be taking a kind of a pro-Russia stance, and that's partly because Russia's now in OPEC, right? They're in OPEC Plus, brought to you by shale, right? I'm not sure if you've all thought about that, but to effectively manage the oil market, as the U.S. rose up into the #1 position in oil production. The Saudis really needed to bring Russia in, and that was kind of, one of the downsides, I guess, from the U.S. perspective of shale. And I think it's been really effective having Russia inside the expanded cartel. And I think, the Saudis, UAE, the other movers and shakers in the cartel want to keep Russia happy and make sure they respect its interests. They're going to need Russia to cut production again at some point. They're going to want that cooperation. So they don't want to alienate Russia. They don't want to be seen to be stealing Russian market share, through picking up too much of its market share. But this new dynamic in OPEC is kind of less friendly to U.S. interests. I think it's safe to say that. And the Saudis and the UAE seem to be seeking U.S. political concessions as well through some of this oil market strategy. The swing producer role that Saudi's been pushing itself to do since the 80s seems to be on hold right now. We haven't really seen them doing this since the 70s, really since the Arab oil embargo, seeking political concessions to withholding oil production capacity despite crisis level prices and supplies in exchange for political concessions. And the second track, if I may, and this is shorter, so sorry. This energy transition, this is sort of the long range, with the plateauing and then eventual decline of oil production. Obviously, a big threat, a future threat looming off for oil economies. And so you've probably heard that some of these countries have announced net zero plans, right? Saudi Arabia, net zero 2060, UAE, net zero 2050. Even Bahrain has kind of gotten on the bandwagon, the net zero bandwagon. It's pretty interesting. These, ostensibly it sounds like something that runs contrary to their interests, or some folks have said maybe this is greenwashing. I don't think so. I think it's a way that these countries can get taken seriously in the climate action conversation, take part in it, shape it into towards the direction that they'd like to see it go. I don't think the Saudis and the Emiratis want to see, or other oil, or Houston for that matter, wants to see all energy, demand being, energy being electrified through renewables, and we sort of proceed that way. I think they still want to keep fuels, these sort of marketable fuels and deliverable fuels that flow through pipelines, et cetera, alive. That fuel model that fuels that you combust is more attractive than electrons made by a renewable infrastructure that needs no fuel, right? It's just a smaller business is renewables. It's not there's no rent component in that business. So the net zero plans are, I think, part of the process of shaping that. I think it's easier than one might think to imagine a Saudi Arabia or a UAE that's gone net zero. There's a contradictory element in this because these countries want to keep on exporting oil. So hoping that the rest of the world doesn't go net zero and continues to use petroleum while they decarbonize their economies. But they have a lot of advantages. Both of these countries have big emissions clusters that are all clustered around each other. They're close to geological storage, so they can use CCS to capture those emissions. They've got a lot of empty land that gets lots of solar radiation. They can make very cheap hydrogen with those assets. Et cetera. And those oil exports don't get tallied on their slate, right? That's somebody else's emissions problem. And you have, countries with really big aviation sectors. International aviation also goes on the international account, doesn't go on their tab. So ostensibly, they could have a good chance to get to these to net zero goals. So why don't I leave it there and kick it back to you.
Thank you. I have a question for the panel in general, so anyone can answer. And this goes to what I think Ambassador Djerejian mentioned this morning or at lunch about perceptions of disengagement. Regardless of whether the US is disengaging or not, the perception is very strong. And that is often driving policy decisions. And one of the ways in which Gulf leaders formed that perception was they took the pivot to Asia in 2010, 2011. And that seemed to encapsulate the US leaving the Middle East. Except the pivot to Asia wasn't a pivot away from the Gulf, it was a pivot away from Europe. It was intended to be a pivot away from Europe towards a future in which the Indo-Pacific was more important to the US. So my question now is, with Ukraine, with Russia, now with the US pouring more attention back into Europe, does that change the position of the Gulf within this wider geopolitical game? And even if it does, will that change Gulf leaders' perceptions? That we've seen how the withdrawal from Afghanistan spooked Gulf leaders. They don't seem to have given the Biden administration credit for working with partners, working with allies over the last 3 months. So even if it does bring the Gulf or bring Europe back in geopolitically, will it make a difference? So anyway, any one of you want to hazard a guess?
Sure.
Toby?
I'd like to connect this, with another point, following on from Jim's talk. In a sense, the question, why is the United States even in the Gulf? Historically, these countries were either British protectorates or British mandates, like in the Iraqi case, or under heavy British influence, like Iran. The United States took over many military bases and so on and so forth after the Second World War. But there was long this assumption that the United States is there to protect the oil, or the free flow of oil. And that obviously, after 1973, 74, that got much more publicity than even before. But it's now almost completely debunked in the academic literature, that notion. Scholars as varied as Gregory Gause on the one hand and Bob Vitalis on the other, convincingly make the case that, in fact, oil markets are markets, and with the exception of the Arab oil embargo, there's actually never really been a major oil producer that didn't want to sell its oil to countries it didn't agree with or something like that. And in the Arab oil embargo, pro-Western and anti-Western states participated, even if the pro-Western states perhaps broke the embargo earlier than the others. But so that's the only sort of major case that we know of states not selling their oil, because they didn't agree ideologically with the other party. In fact, what we're seeing in the case of Iraq in the 90s and Iran to a certain extent, and today with Russia, is some countries, buyer countries, thinking we don't want to buy from that country, and therefore, undermining the market. And so that brings us to back to the question: why is the United States in the Gulf then? Because, Iran after the Iranian Revolution didn't stop, exporting its oil or selling its oil. It had problems keeping its refineries on track, so it's, over time its production reduced. But it's not because Iran didn't want to, get dollars by selling its oil. And then for a period, it's because the country, and like with Russia now, it can't sell its oil in dollars. So, similar problems occurred with Iran. But Iran changed ideologically and changed its foreign policy. It didn't change its oil export policy. So why is the United States then in the Gulf? And it strikes me that the main reason is strategic and military. And so that makes sense, since it sort of took over Britain's role in that sort of, especially in the sort of, naval kind of strategy, global naval strategy towards Asia and onwards towards Australia and so on and so forth, communications, and sort of why the basically Cold War, strategy, the Gulfs being somewhat close to the southern border of the Soviet Union, and to countries like Iran and Afghanistan, that are sort of, bordering the Soviet Union and strategic. So if the main purpose is, military, then we don't need to talk about, oil so much. And in an ideal world, the sort of proposals that we've been talking about today, internationalizing Gulf security, multilateralism would lead to sort of, a better understanding of both regional players and international powers, right? They could sort of cooperate, the Chinese navies, the Indian, Russia, the United States, some European powers were already there, France, Britain especially, and sort of, lead the world towards a better future, right? Because we all want the same thing. Well, maybe not all of us want oil to flow as long as others, But ultimately, nobody wants to have not many people want to have major, interstate wars or, world wars, and especially not in this region, because, for many reasons, because, religious reasons as well, and, we've seen what, how Iraq turned out and so on and so forth. Sort of international terrorism and all these sort of ideas. But my fear is more that, in my lifetime, hopefully quite a long time, I don't know, but, over the course of this century, we more see sort of really very serious conflicts, and that they will crystallize as in the 20th century, partly in this region. And I think we see sort of the start of that. Many of the things I talked about previously are probably completely unrealistic now, given the the escalation of the relationship between the United States and Russia. I don't see how it now in the Middle East. It's put the JCPOA or POA more or less on hold, or at least delayed it. So that's it's very bad, and especially if the United States is moving more towards a real confrontation with China. This region will be really in the middle of everything, and it's on the way of the Belt and Road Initiative, both of the sea and land route. China is very expanding dramatically economic footprints, political alliances, and has this region. Perhaps it doesn't understand the region yet as well as Europeans, some Europeans and some Americans, but it's working hard on that. And my fear is more that rather than disengaging, we might see some very serious, problems in this region. And that's very sad to me because I feel very close to, the people of this region. It's what I spent sort of my professional career working on. And because I don't want to see, major wars happening.
Thank you.
Sorry for this rant.
No, thank you. Well, you mentioned the JCPOA, and I'd like to ask Mohammed, what is the status of the negotiations?
Sure. Can I say something about the first question first, and then?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, very, very quick. So, although that perception of the U.S. disengagement from the region is probably, or rather misperception, is widespread in the Arab world. On the Iranian side, it doesn't seem to be the case. At least the statements that the Iranian leaders make tell us that they have no illusion that the U.S. is going to be around, whether it's for oil or back its allies in the region. So when the U.S. assassinated General Qasem Soleimani 2 years ago, Iranian leaders said the best revenge is to try to push the U.S. out of the region. And this is their policy. That's what they want to do. They don't think the U.S. is going to leave the region. They think the U.S. is going to be preoccupied by China and Russia, but it will stay in the region unless Iran is trying to push the U.S. out. And they will try to do it by using the allies that they have in the region. I mean, we see daily rocket attacks in Iraq and other areas. Also, they see the U.S. as, for all the reasons that Toby mentioned, as a destabilizing force. That it invaded Iraq, it created a lot of chaos. But also, they see the U.S. as a threat to the Iranian regime itself. That no matter what Iran does, the U.S. will never ever accept the realities of what they call the reality of the Islamic Republic. So, and so they want to counter the U.S.'s presence in the region. As I said, by trying to push the U.S. out, but also by encouraging and inviting more involvement by Russia and China in the Persian Gulf. So that is definitely the case. They're welcoming. So if as Jim said, the Saudis have a pro-Russia stance, so you can imagine the Iranians would definitely welcome Russia as well for a lot of different reasons. On the JCPOA. So there have been a lot of negotiations since the new Iranian president, Ibrahim Raisi, came to power a year ago. But Iran's approach has drastically changed. Iran has adopted a much more hardline policy. They actually blamed the Rouhani administration for being too nice, too flexible on the JCPOA, both drafting the JCPOA and then trying to implement the JCPOA. And they think the appeasement emboldens the U.S. So that's why this administration is a lot more hawkish. They are less flexible, as I said, but they also have, they want the JCPOA because the sanctions are seriously hurting the country. They want to see that the U.S. is back to the JCPOA, but the main concern is they just don't think the U.S. would allow Iran to benefit economically from it. And even if the U.S. returns to the JCPOA, they think that the next administration in 2 years will pull out again, will violate the agreement again. So they have serious concerns. On the United States side, there are concerns as well, mostly domestic issues. They just don't want to remove the sanctions because they think Iran will use the economic benefits to, as I said, back its supporters and be more active in the region. So the two sides have a lot of incentives on the one hand to return to the JCPOA. On the other hand, there are a lot of other sticking points that will prevent this from happening. But let me just say one final point, and that is, at the same time, the status quo is not sustainable either, because according to a lot of reports, Iran is only a few weeks away from becoming a nuclear threshold state, which means we'll have enough materials to be able to build a bomb, which will take a year or more. So the U.S. does not want Iran to cross that line either. So there are various proposals. One is, I actually wrote about this a few years ago, a less for less options, that Iran would scale back certain aspects of its nuclear programs and the U.S. will not lift the sanctions, but reduce some of the sanctions. So there are some proposals. We'll have to see what will happen. So,
thank you. For Catherine, we're approaching 20 years now since the ousting of Saddam Hussein. Time does fly. And in your book, which I highly recommend, you you make a compelling argument that, talking about misperceptions, King Abdullah and the way he perceived of Saudi Arabia, the way he perceived the Iraqi leadership under Nouri al-Maliki had a pretty strong impact on the lack of Saudi engagement with Iraq, and then of course leaving the field open perhaps for Iran to also expand influence. We now have a new generation of leadership both in Iraq and in Saudi Arabia. So my question is, does Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and the people around him, do they see Iraq in a different way than King Abdullah and his leadership generation did?
That's a good question. And I think it's still an open question, to be honest. And I will say it's a new generation of leadership on the Saudi side, absolutely, across the board. I mean, in 2015, it's like everybody, it changed over in Saudi Arabia. On the Iraq side, it's not really a new generation of leaders. You know, speaking of Nouri al-Maliki, he's still, you know, very much a player in Iraqi politics. And the people that, you know, on the Sunni side, there's some new faces. But for the most part, on the Kurds, it's also sort of a new generation of leadership, but it's really sort of like the sons of, you know, the previous generation. And among the Shia parties, and obviously the Shia parties, you know, constitute a majority of all the parties. You know, it's to a large extent all the same players. I think that the Saudis, I take a totally, in my book and in my research, I sort of take a very contrarian position. And I kind of joke sometimes that I'm, you know, one of the only people in DC who has something halfway decent to say about Nouri al-Maliki. And, you know, I fear that I sometimes come off as an apologist for Nouri al-Maliki, which is like a very, you know, it's never my objective in my life or career to be an apologist for Nouri al-Maliki. So it's definitely not my intention to defend him. You know, he certainly has made plenty of mistakes as prime minister and was somebody who could be very ruthless and, you know, extremely heavy-handed. But, you know, I argue actually that, you know, at the beginning of his premiership, he made an effort to engage with the Saudis, and I argue, based on what I consider to be extensive research, you know, I argue that he made a good faith effort to engage with the Saudis, and that the reason for sort of this real rupture between Iraq and Saudi Arabia was really a function of the late King Abdullah really not being able to see the new Iraq, a Shia-led Iraq, as anything other than an Iranian vassal state. And this is really much more a function of deeply embedded beliefs, misperceptions, simplistic beliefs among the Saudis than it was about really what was going on in the ground in Iraq. You know, the Saudis may have seen the Iraqi Shia as Iranian puppets, but, you know, I can tell you with confidence that, you know, Iraqi Shia political leaders, you know, they may have close ties to Iran. Some have closer ties than others, but none of them want to be puppets. You know, they all have their own interests and consider themselves to be their own actors. Now, you know, in terms of today, you know, I think that I think that the Saudis recognize that. They made mistakes. I know this from kind of multiple sources that, you know, I think the Saudis recognize that, you know, they might not say this openly, that they made mistakes in not accepting and not engaging with Iraq in the Abdullah and Maliki period. And, you know, this has been sort of, and, you know, they really have changed course considerably. You know, and particularly in the last 5 years, you see Iraq and Saudi Arabia taking steps to reestablish a relationship. And this sort of started off slowly, kind of after 2017, 2018, and in the last year or two has kind of picked up pace. And so that's all good. The question, and I think that, you know, I think that the Saudis will always struggle to really, you know, I think that the Saudis would have always preferred a Sunni-led Iraq. I think that there's no question that the Saudis will always sort of struggle with a Shia-led Iraq, and will always, you know, just there'll be, you know, a little bit less trust with Shia Iraqi leaders than there would have been with Sunni Iraqi leaders. As much as the Saudis detested Saddam Hussein, there was no question that Saddam was, an Arab, and I think that the Saudis, as much as they've changed course, still struggle with that, with Shia leaders in Iraq. I think that they see Qadami. I think that they have I think that they, for the most part, trust Qadami. Now, of course, Qadami might not get a second term as prime minister. I think that they will. I think that they will accept reality, and engage with whoever does succeed Qadami.
Okay.
That's probably more than anybody expected to hear about Saudi Arabia and Iraq at this panel.
Thank you. And then Jim, quickly. All Gulf countries have these ambitious visions. We've heard a lot about Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia, and of course, we're now closer to 2030 than we are to King Salman, well, about equidistant to him coming to power in 2015. So time is marching on. Do surging energy prices facilitate and complement those visions, or do they complicate them in the sense of making it less urgent for that diversification to happen, just because the windfall is now so great?
Yeah, it's a bit of both, right? I mean, so it makes it easier to invest in your economy, to diversify it in the ways that that these vision plans envision, right? But it also makes sure, at the same time, your economy your GDP just got more oil intensive, right? So your diversification went in the opposite direction because your oil rents, your oil revenues just went up as a portion of GDP. But I guess they've been through this exercise so many times, these cycles so many times now. They've been hearing the IMF and the World Bank and others, the World Economic Forum, et cetera, kind of banging on about this. They're seeing oil, which, since the 1930s has basically had a monopoly on transportation services. And that's what makes it so strategically important, because, one of the big consumers of transportation services are militaries, right? And I would argue that's probably the main reason the U.S. is in the Gulf, is because, oil is so strategically important to economies, to businesses, but also to militaries, right? I mean, you don't need to destroy a country's military to win a war with that country, to defeat it in a battle. You just need to block its the availability of fuel to that country's military, and then it can't operate any of its weaponry. So it's and also the Gulf is also where oil prices are formed. I mean, this is the main export center of the world, and that's what, it's not the direct importation of Gulf oil that we depend on anymore. We depend on it for price formation, and our prices are based on those in the international market, which really the biggest influencer of those is the Gulf. So it's an important place. Unfortunately for the Gulf, if oil loses its monopoly on transportation services, as it's starting to, we're starting to see electricity now creeping in on the margins in transport. Oil becomes less strategically important, and then we may not want to spend so much blood and treasure in that part of the world, and keep us, spend $100 billion plus a year operating bases there, and also those countries that depend on oil exports might lose some of their geopolitical stature, right? They become, less important actors on the world stage. So this diversification, for all those reasons, is, it's a distasteful thing to do. I don't think they want to do it. I mean, oil has been extraordinarily successful a business for them. That's the only economic sector there is on the planet that I know of that consistently has this rent component, this extraordinary profit component. In all other businesses, competition will move into that sector and drive down profits to a more reasonable rate. And oil is the only one that holds those sort of durable rent portion, the durable, extraordinary profits. So they don't want to get out of that business. They don't really want to diversify their economies. But I think if you look at it from a regime standpoint through that regime security lens, they don't want to be, they want to have a hedge. They want to have a plan B, if oil does lose its importance. And climate action, too, is also important to the Gulf. I mean, the Gulf is on the front lines of climate damage. They're being damaged. I mean, they're on equatorial part of the world. They're having disastrous heat waves and dust storms and everything else. So they, for sort of physical livability reasons, they need climate action to succeed in that part of the world, too. So it's a tough spot. I don't think they're making it. I can't say that these vision plans have been successful this time around. They might have been a bit overambitious. But some of them in the past have been underambitious, and they've exceeded them. So, I think those also go in cycles.
Thank you. Well, we're running short of time, and we have one more panel that has to finish at 5. So I propose to have one round of questions. So if you do want to ask a question, we'll take them in a group, and then I'll ask the panelists to respond. So yeah, go ahead.
So, given the material shortages to scaling the energy transition, namely if it's to batteries and semiconductors. So given shortages to batteries and semiconductors in the energy transition, are there any potential initiatives to grow rare earth mineral exports from the Persian states? I know there's some reserves of lithium in Afghanistan. I'm sure that could be explored. What do you say about this?
Great. And there were other questions? Yeah, you say, go ahead.
There's been a remarkable lack of discussion on the Gulf of Aden and the Yemenites. But we know that Iran has invested heavily in forming a firm military alliance with the Yemenites in order to cut off shipping. Of course, the Persian Gulf is one access of petroleum to the western states, but the Gulf of Aden is also another access, and is far more deadly than the Persian Gulf at this point in time. So I wonder what the thoughts of the panel are on focusing our attention on the Gulf of Aden and the threat of Iran and its alliance with the Yemenites in cutting off shipping in through that channel.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. There are 2 questions on this table here. So yeah.
Um, 21 years ago, we had the 9/11. And shortly after that, a group of neocons convinced Dick Cheney, Rumsfeld, to wage a war and destroy 7 countries in 5 years. They destroyed 6. But they were never ever able to do it with Iran. And I believe they never will be able to do so. I wonder why they got the other 6 and they didn't go after Iran. And of course, in my opinion, the 9/11 was a ground controlled demolition. So what is the intent of the next administration would be, or the coming administrations? Because Iran, just at 6,000, and Iran being Shiite, is only 10% of the population of the Muslims. And yet they went after all the Sunni countries, but they never touched Iran. And only one comment adding to that is the 6,000 members of Hezbollah defeated the most advanced Israeli military in 2006 and got them out of Lebanon, where all Arab governments, with all the billions and trillions of dollars they spend on military, they couldn't do. but 6,000. That's all it was, the members of the Hezbollah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And then there's one more question. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. So you guys mentioned climate and the Gulf. As far as net zero projections or whatever, in Saudi Arabia or Bahrain, is there any significant investment in carbon sequestration and carbon collection? And if so, have they brought any fruit?
Okay, great. I think we'll ask each of the panelists to respond in 1 or 2 minutes each. Kitty, Kasim?
Yeah, so I'm going to, on the political economy questions, which were sort of a big theme, I'm going to defer to my colleague, Dr. Crane. And to, I'll just say on the 2003 invasion, so you know, the neocon project, you know, Iraq was the cornerstone, or there was the thought to obviously take that model and, you know, regime change in Iran, regime change in Syria. I think the neocons had their hands full in Iraq, the model was not taken elsewhere. The Americans most definitely walked into a complete mess of their own making.
Okay, Jim.
So on the energy transition minerals question, I don't know of a lot of mineral production in that region. I mean, I know there's deposits and there's some pretty good geology around the region, right? So I think, you know, Saudi has a bit. I've heard a bit about Afghanistan having some. It's in Iran, actually. Iran's got a lot of copper in Iran. But whether the costs of extraction of those are, you know, mining them, you know, at this point, you know, maybe not, right? So there's a huge question around the energy transition and mineral usage. I think it's safe to say that, you know, if we get a lot of our energy from, through, wind and solar rather than, let's say, coal, for example, the material that we consume will be greatly reduced, right? So because we're not burning fuel, so that the infrastructure is more materials intensive, but if there's no fuel that you burn, the materials that you need is a smaller amount. So there's a big conversation to be had about that, and we've got some papers on that you can read. The other one on the CCS in the Gulf, carbon capture and storage, yes, this is something that they're pushing pretty hard. There's a couple of carbon capture and storage projects. I guess I'd call them kind of pilot projects. They're using the carbon dioxide for enhanced oil recovery, but at some point they're going to start producing hydrogen by splitting natural gas, blue hydrogen, and sequestering the carbon from that. I think there's a pilot project on that now. They've done some exports of ammonia through that same process. So it's one of the strategies that favors oil and gas producing countries. So it's one that they'd like to push and perfect and bring the costs down on.
Okay, Toby.
Just quickly on Yemen, I mean, that's way too complicated to explain now in 1 minute, but just one point, in this war against the Houthis, basically, that's been waged for the last 7 years now, a lot of the damage was due to, a naval blockade that the Gulf States coalition did on the Yemeni ports and prevented, on the one hand, arms coming in, but primarily, food and other supplies. So a lot of the starvation and, mass, basically murder, is due to that. So I think, we should focus our attention on things like that, which are much bigger than, attacking one ship or hijacking, one ship. Just a minor point on the climate issue. I mean, I think some years, perhaps decades from now, we'll be confronted with a very difficult relationship, possibly, with oil producers in the Gulf that can produce at very low costs and can export oil really, even if the price goes very low, still at a profit. If the climate emergency continues to worsen as it inevitably will, and at some point we're sort of forced to ban oil exploration in other parts of the world, perhaps, and then I'm not sure. I have no idea how it's going to develop, but it might be that the situation will be, the relationship will be very, very different from today.
And Mohammed,
on the 9/11 issue and the 2003 invasion of Iraq, yes, absolutely. The U.S. would have attacked Iran if it could. I remember I was a graduate student in Washington at the time, and a popular line among the neocons was, probably have heard this: "Men go to Baghdad, real men go to Tehran." So yes, there was a lot of appetite, but there is maybe we don't have a lot of appetite now. Although, if you talk to the Iranian leaders, they think the U.S. would attack Iran any moment if it could. And I think the only reason the U.S. has not and may not attack Iran anytime soon is precisely because of these proxies that Iran has. And as there was a report a few months ago that Qasem Soleimani, before he was killed, he told people around him that he has created, I think, if I remember correctly, 6 layers of proxies around Iran as deterrence that any country, if the U.S. wants to invade Iran, it has to go through these layers. So they don't take this for granted that the U.S. is not going to attack Iran because it's busy or because it's preoccupied with Russia or China. They think it cannot. That's why it hasn't. So, and that's a concern that they still have. They think the U.S. has not shelved its regime change policy. Could be a misperception, but that's how they think. Very quickly on the issue of Yemen. So yes, Iranian leaders do say that they may soon control 2 important strategic straits in the world: the Hormuz Strait in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, as you mentioned. But guess what? This is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Iran was not as involved in Yemen before the Saudis started bombing Yemen in 2015. The Houthis pre-exist the Iranian government, the Iranian revolution. So they have real grievances and issues. But yes, Iran exploited the issue. And once the Saudis started bombing Yemen in 2015, then Iran and the Houthis, they forged very deep, important strategic alliances. But as I said, a lot of this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It wasn't like this in 2015 before the Saudis invaded the Houthis. Now the Houthis are a powerful ally of Iran, and they have sophisticated missiles, and they have the audacity that attacked Saudi Arabia in Riyadh, in Jeddah, and Saudi civilian and military facilities. But it's partly what the Saudis brought on to themselves by bombing Yemen for years. So, and of course, Iran and other countries would take advantage and exploit any opportunities that they have. So, as I said, it is partly a self-fulfilling prophecy, unfortunately.
okay, well, please join me in thanking the panel.